ourselves ready for this exciting conversation. My name is Kate Shapiro. I'm going to be moderating tonight. We're going to give folks 1 or 2 more minutes to hop on, but we also invite everybody, if they want to go ahead and introduce yourself in the chat. We love to know your name, where you're phoning or zooming in from, and a word to describe how you're doing today, if you are so moved to share. So welcome, welcome. We are excited to have you all joining us virtually for this super exciting panel and conversation. So welcome, everyone. And we'll get started at about 8:03. All right, Australia, come on now. And Hawaii. Blessings, friends. Good evening, everybody. Good evening. Yes, there's going to be closed captioning for this conversation tonight, but there is not going to be translation, unfortunately. That is not inside of our capacity, but we will have closed captioning tonight. Good evening, everybody. Awesome. Great. Well, everyone, welcome, welcome, welcome. People are already introducing themselves on the chat. You're welcome to drop your name, where you're coming in from, and a word to describe how you're doing if you'd like to. Yeah, my name is Kate Shapiro. I'm the organizing director at the Women's March, and lucky to be moderating this conversation tonight. We are gonna, the way that this is gonna look tonight is that we're gonna do this welcome that we're doing, a little bit of a frame up around the conversation, and that the bulk majority of our conversation tonight is gonna be hearing from our amazing panelists. Then we're gonna do a questions and answers and close. We have about 830 folks signed up for tonight, and we just wanna extend a big gratitude, of course, to our panelists, but also a gratitude to all of you for doing what you had to do to be with us. We know that these times are anything but normal, and there's a great deal of fear and grief and loss and chaos in so many of our lives. We have a really amazing panel that I'm going to introduce really briefly right now that's going to be leading the conversation tonight. We've got Bridget Burns, who's the director of Women's Environment and Development Organization, WeDo. We have Cindy Weisner, executive director of Grassroots Global Justice Alliance. We have Tara Houska, founder of Giniw Collective. We have Diana Duarte, the director of policy and strategic engagement at MADRE. We have Osprie Orielle Lake, the executive director of Women's Earth and Climate Action Network, We Can, and Jacqui Patterson, environmental and climate justice senior director at NAACP. These are some heavy hitters, friends. This panel is not going to be messing around tonight, so this is super exciting. Just a little bit of a word about the tech that we're going to be using, that we're already using. We just want to invite people, of course, to use the chat and continue to be able to use the chat to share ideas, what have you, respond to the brilliance that you're going to hear from this panel tonight. But just to say, we are not going to really be able to track questions unless you put them in the Q&A box. So there's a Q&A box at the bottom of your screen, and that is the place you want to put your question, because we can't keep up with y'all in the chat, to be totally frank. So help us help ourselves on that. The other thing too is that there is closed captioning available for this call that's happening live. If you want to enjoy that, you can go to the bottom of your screen and there's a button that says closed caption. Click on that and you will be ready to rock with the closed captions. Great. So I'm going to do a little bit of framing, and then we're going to get into the heart of the matter with our panelists. So just to start off, given the threat and existing and increasing threat of the coronavirus, we here at the Women's March understand that many women in our constituency will be feeling overwhelmed, isolated, and unsure of where to turn for tools and support. We feel that too. This is the 10th webinar we've done in the last few weeks as a way to help connect us to each other, connect you all with the resources and tools relevant to this moment, and connect the dots of what all is going down right now. We need to come together to be able to understand not only the personal, but also the political implications of this moment and how to act, especially in a time of social distancing and a failed and deeply flawed federal response. So we know a few things for sure. Women of all walks of life are and will remain on the front lines of this pandemic in many ways. With our paid and unpaid labor, we do the majority of caretaking for the sick, the vulnerable, the old, and the young, as well as the majority of the caretaking for the earth. Care of people and care of the planet are the same work. Gotta get some tea in here. In the last 2 weeks, women marchers have made over 120,000 masks for essential workers and community members. Many have pledged that they will keep making them as long as their sewing machines function, they can get fabric, and the need remains. This is what we mean when we talk about how it is our profound privilege as Women's March to coordinate and harness the support of Women's March activists. In the last few weeks, we have heard government and business leaders state publicly that human life and the source of life itself, planet Earth, are worth sacrificing for the alleged health of the economy and elites. We also see the writing on the wall from the far right in this time. Human lives, especially those of the old, the vulnerable, the poor, Black people, people of color, and women, etc., are not as important as corporate bailouts and protecting the assets of 1%. We give thanks also for the decades of work and organizing and people who have been fighting for the health and protection of the planet and working to stop the climate crisis for decades. We know this work did not start with the Green New Deal or with our friend Greta Thunberg, and that Indigenous, Black, working class, rural, environmental justice activists and climate justice activists have been going all in for all of us for decades. And we know that the environmental movement and climate movement have suffered major setbacks because of a refusal historically to engage structural realities of power around class and race. The other setback that many environmental movements have also faced over the decades is the question of difficulties in agreeing around scale. How do we actually combat this climate crisis? Is it market-based solutions? Is it community gardens? How do we tackle something so big? I also want to invite folks now to, if they want to, as I'm wrapping up my framing, if there is a activist or an organizer from the environmental justice movement or for the climate justice movement that trained you up, that you walk in the legacy of, that you have been inspired by or moved by, knowing that this movement has been made by thousands and thousands before us, we welcome you to say their name and to put it in the chat. Couple more things, then I'm going to turn it over to our panelists. The Green New Deal was popularized widely by the Sunrise Movement, but is an aspirational as well as a practical set of ideas that come from many sources. What is so moving to us is that it is a container for dreaming, connecting vision with a structural intervention to a huge, huge crisis. Oh, I love seeing the names come in on the chat. That's moving me. Green New Deal style legislation is the type of legislation that we need on so many fronts, now more than ever. Additionally, it is a policy framework that came through movements, which is a rare and precious thing, and that addresses interlocking crises, the crisis of work, the crisis of equity and justice, and the crisis of climate. We as movement have been working and fighting and dreaming for how to contend with increasing crises and unnatural disasters for generations. Now we are also in a bridge moment with the coronavirus and the people's bailouts or the bottom-up bailouts to be able to dream big, demand big, and know that we can and must apply huge-scale solutions to these crises in our time. We know all too well what is at stake. We are thrilled to be able to have a beautiful panel with us tonight to dive deeper into some of these questions and conversation. I'm so looking forward to it. I'm going to invite us all to just take one deep breath together, and then we're going to get to it. Awesome. So once again, I want to invite people to be able, if you want your question to be tracked, I also can't promise that all questions will be answered, but we're going to try for folks to put your questions in the Q&A box as our panelists are speaking and sharing some of their wisdom. Awesome. So we first up, we have Bridget from We Do. And the question that we would love for you to be able to answer is, what is the feminist Green New Deal? And why is gender analysis key to climate action and policy for a just recovery?
Thank you so much, Kate. And it is really wonderful seeing all these names coming through on the chat, so many of whom are real leaders and mentors of mine as well. So thank you for inviting that and making that space. Good afternoon, evening, y'all. It's really an honor to be with you, particularly in these times. And I just want to start by wishing you good spirits and good health and an abundance of joy in whatever ways you are able to find it. And if you find yourself among the thousands of frontline workers holding us up in this moment, we celebrate you with gratitude and solidarity. And to those who are struggling in the multiple ways that we all are, we send you love. So as said, my name is Bridget Burns. I use she, her pronouns. I'm originally from the Bronx, but based in Brooklyn. And I'm the director of We Do, which is the Women's Environment and Development Organization. And it's a 30-year-old global advocacy organization that works at the intersection of gender and environmental justice. You know, working at the intersections of multiple forms of crisis is not a new task for feminist advocates. And I think one very clear thread among the different allies, the many different allies you'll hear from on this webinar, is an understanding that feminist action is collective action. And it was quite natural then in early 2019 when the many organizations who make up the Feminist Green New Deal Coalition turned toward each other to think through the ways we could and we must bring a strong feminist vision and analysis to both movement building and policy making around a Green New Deal here in the United States. We understood inherently that a truly intersectional feminist vision would require a coalition of individuals and organizations working towards justice at all of the intersections that the environmental crisis touches. You said a lot about this, Kate, already, but we know it touches all of them. Migrant justice, racial justice, economic justice, labor justice, reproductive justice, and gender justice. And we came together knowing that any feminist approach to a Green New Deal must seek to combat and repair historical oppressions. It must advance a transformative feminist agenda, centers the leadership of women. It must address generational impacts of colonization and anti-Black racism. It must be led and articulated by frontline impacted communities, especially women of color, Black women, Indigenous women, people with disabilities, queer folks, people from the global South, migrant and refugee communities, and youth. We started in our conversations and collective reflections together by defining a set of 10 principles to put this vision on paper and to articulate what our collective feminist analysis looks like. And for us, it includes that a feminist Green New Deal requires intersectional gender analysis across all actions, ensures democratically controlled community-led solutions, really speaking to that issue of scale you mentioned, Kate, rejects false and harmful responses to climate change that fail to address root causes, and fundamentally creates regenerative economies that center systemic feminist alternatives. And with all of this, again, as a guiding factor in our coalition, it recognizes that there's actually no such thing as domestic climate policy. So even in the context of a US Green New Deal, we must commit to global justice through diplomacy, international cooperation, and a reckoning that the United States has been the world's largest historic carbon polluter, while those in the global South have suffered its worst impacts. So today we're finding ourselves in a crisis among crises, a global pandemic which is not serving as a great equalizer, as many would say, or some have said, but is actually serving as a great exacerbator, very similar to the impacts of climate change. And it's a moment that's challenging us to create deep, urgent, systemic change. And it's showing the deep fault lines in our societies and how our societies are organized or disorganized, I should say. We think it's a moment of reckoning and reevaluation of whose labor is essential and how to create resilient communities able to provide social protection and care. And as you said, you know, this is a future we have envisioned before, that Indigenous peoples have envisioned for us, that grassroots feminists have been calling for. It's a vision based on the feminist principles for a Green New Deal, and it's the vision that must frame our post-COVID world. It's how we deliver on a just recovery, knowing that justice has to be intentional to be actually just. And I think one thing to really think about, you know, when you look at these principles, we're not providing these principles as a lofty utopian goal, but as leverages for change. And we've seen how putting care at the center of policy planning can light a spark for transformation. Just this week, I think we've all been inspired, and many of you might have seen this and you might not have, that Hawaii's Commission on the Status of Women put forward the first explicitly feminist economic recovery plan for COVID-19, aimed at not returning to normal, but building a system that is capable of delivering on gender equality. And in the last few years, we've actually seen 7 governments who have made or indicated that they are developing feminist foreign policies. And these policies are not equal, nor are they adequate, but it certainly allows for a deeply important conversation around what has been an inadequacy in our minds of efforts to deliver on gender equality so far, particularly because they're often delinked from systemic root causes, whether that be trade or concentration of corporate power or environmental destruction and militarism. And so what I hope, in just closing this piece, that you'll find in the offerings, my colleagues who again are my inspirations in this work, and some truly extraordinary feminist leaders, thinkers, is that exactly what my colleague Nolene Abolivu, who I would have brought, and I am trying to bring into this conversation, recently said, and I quote this: "We don't have time for small work. What we need is big work." And the work we're trying to do together in the Feminist Green New Deal Coalition as feminists is the critical big work of making the impossible possible, of demanding justice across multiple forms of oppression, of leaving no one behind, and of leading in radical struggle and solidarity. So that's it from me. Over to y'all.
Fantastic. Thank you, Bridget. All right, Cindy, we're going to hear from you next, and we would love for you to speak to this question, which is, what does it look like to bring an intersectional feminist analysis to the crisis we are facing right now?
All right, saludos, mi gente. Really happy to be here with my fellow panelists, amazing leaders, and also thank you so much to the Women's March and everyone who organized this conversation, and hello to everybody who is joining us. I want to start off with a quote with somebody who's been really grounding me, their work in this moment of the pandemic, of this crisis. It's Berta Cáceres, that many of you may know or may not know. She is a Lenca, feminist, internationalist, social movement leader from Honduras who was murdered 4 years ago. And she has this quote that I come to a lot. It says, "Let us wake up, humankind. We are out of time. We must shake our conscience free from the rapacious capitalism, racism, and patriarchy that will only assure our own self-destruction." So Berta and many social movement leaders across the United States, or across Turtle Island, across the world, have been working on alternatives. And the question that they've been putting forward are alternatives to the system that we see right now is so broken, right? You have campesina people putting forward food sovereignty and agroecology. You have folks demanding commons, right? The defense of the commons and what belongs to people and not privatization. Folks in the environmental justice movement that have talked about a regenerative economy. Indigenous folks in the Andean region that have spoken about buen vivir, and people who have been fighting and building the solidarity economy, and many feminists around the world in different articulations talking about a feminist economy. So we think that this moment, there's multiple crises colliding. And I think we're at the crossroads of either continuing to see the trend towards authoritarianism or something completely new. And we believe it's a moment to think about the whole reorganization of society. We think that, like Bridget said, what was impossible 6 weeks ago here in the United States is now becoming common sense. There's moratoriums on rent and mortgages. There's the demand of student debt and the freeing of people of locked in cages from jails to juvenile centers to detention centers, demands of workers being paid hazard pay, sick leave, and then masses of people demanding a people's bailout and not the bailout of CEOs and corporations. This is a moment where we have to reimagine a new model, and we cannot go back to what was considered normal. What was also invisible and undervalued is completely and underpaid, from domestic work to child rearing to food production, healthcare, etc. We call that reproductive labor. And reproductive labor now is completely visible. It was like overnight, it became so visible, and it's in fact what is keeping us alive. And this is a moment to really also shift the patriarchal frameworks that we see play out, replacing policy and practices and behavior with ethics of care and collectivism, where we put life at the center of the economy, not capital. And part of what we've been talking, the movement that we come from in Grassroots Global Justice and the Climate Justice Alliance, we talk about just transition, right? And we talk also about that we need to be able to move away from an extractive model, right? An extractive paradigm towards a more just, regenerative, and what we would add feminist economy that leaves no one behind, and that it repairs the historical and systemic harms that have been perpetuated on oppressed people and communities. And we know that women and gender nonconforming queer folks have been at the forefront of this EJ movement for just transition, but also we've been trying to talk about the necessity for a new political, cultural, economic alternative. So we've been working on principles of a feminist economy, one that ensures bodily autonomy and self-determination, that this is an opportunity, like we're seeing now, to socialize reproductive labor, that we're in right relationship to people, and that we're in right relationship to nature. And so part of what's important is that we have to be able to think about the role of gender in the economy, right? That we need to think about the impact where we have an extractive war-making economy, a patriarchal-based economy, and what its impacts are. So in the day-to-day work that many of our members do, they fight against toxic chemicals and pollutants that are jeopardizing our health, and that we know that disproportionate impact on Black, poor, Indigenous, Latinx people is because of environmental racism. We know that folks that are fighting against not only the pipelines, but also the man camps in mining towns that are become sites of gendered violence. And we see the epidemic of missing and murdered Native women and girls. And part of it is that we think of a feminist economy framework really recognizes the centrality of reproductive labor, predominantly performed by women and femmes, which is often unpaid, and that we also know there's a global division, sexual division of labor that also happens between women of the North and women in the global South. So part of what I think we've been trying to say is in this moment, right? One, that reproductive labor, right, is ultimately low carbon. It's life producing, it's life sustaining, and it's necessary whether we live in an extractive or a regenerative economy. And we have a choice, right, to think about what does it mean to move towards something so different than what got us into this mess. And so a just transition to a feminist regenerative economy gives us an opportunity to push boldly from divestment against extractive and war-making economies, and an investment that puts us in right relationship to the Mother Earth, to planet, that honors and repairs relationship and has reparations to communities that have been disproportionately impacted, and that we think about how we center joy, dignity, life in this moment. And so that's the task, I think, the opportunity for us in this new moment on how do we pave the pathway to the visionary, transformative world that we so desperately need, and how we have to center life and not capital at this moment. Thank you.
Yes, come through, Cindy. Awesome. I have questions, but we're not going to get to my questions. We're gonna hear from folks later, their questions. So next we've got Diana from MADRE, and we would love for you to be able to speak to what would a policy response to the pandemic that's rooted in an ethic of care for people and the planet look like?
Right. Well, thank you very much. I'm feeling really grateful to be here right now and to be part of this conversation with you all. Again, my name is Diana Duarte. I'm with MADRE. We're an international rights organization, for those of you who don't know. We work in partnership with grassroots women-led organizations in communities worldwide that are facing war and disaster. And I want to start by extending my hopes that all on this call are safe and healthy, and that your families and communities are as well. You know, recognizing that this is an incredibly, vulnerable and unsettling moment that we're all in right now. And it's that way not only because of the immediate danger that we and our communities face right now, but just because it's hard. It's hard to not know what the future will bring and how we'll be able to navigate our way through this crisis. So, I know that I'm trying to stay grounded in the things that we do know. And one of those things is that the choices we make now about how we're going to respond to and recover from this pandemic are going to shape the way we live for years to come. And it's the same with the climate crisis that we're facing. In both cases, the scale of the threats that we face demands immediate action to protect this planet and to protect life. And in both cases, our urgent response to crisis has to be, as my co-panelists have been saying, has to be anchored in an ethic of care. That has to be a key feature of a feminist Green New Deal, and it's the focus of what I want to say tonight. And it's also a guiding ethic of MADRE's work with our partners worldwide. So centering care as a way to seize the moment and to build the world that we want to see, what does that ultimately look like? First, it means revaluing fundamentally care work. It means, we know that care work that's often performed by women and girls of color and immigrant women has been routinely invisibilized and dismissed. It's treated as secondary to so-called productive or real, quote unquote, real work. But anyone who's actually had to do that work can tell you it's absolutely not secondary. It's life-sustaining and absolutely essential work that our entire societies are predicated upon, and it's essential especially now. And care work compels us to see beyond ourselves and to see ourselves in relationship with communities both near and far. And so it has to emerge as a dominant and guiding ethic for our policies and practices moving forward. We vitally and so obviously now need teachers, healthcare workers, domestic workers, childcare workers, farm workers. So we need to create policies that protect and support those workers as part of the just recovery that we're imagining. And so that means universal healthcare, free childcare, paid sick and family leave, a living wage, progressive policies both here in the US and all around the world that we have needed and deserved all along, but that are all the more vitally needed right now. And, as we've been saying, as we're talking about just recovery to a green economy, we have to recognize that this labor too is some of the most low carbon work that is out there. Another point I wanted to raise is, of course, care for the planet itself. It means prioritizing care for our planet, for land, for water, for resources, and for all life, and moving beyond and totally rejecting this extractive, exploitative model of economy to one that is, as we've been saying, regenerative, just, and sustainable. And it's not getting back to normal. That's not what we want right now, because we know that getting back to normal just means an unjust and unsustainable status quo. Instead, this is a moment where people are open to, they have an appetite for transformative solutions, and so we need to put them on the table. So those are the kinds of solutions imagined by a feminist Green New Deal, whether it's keeping fossil fuels in the ground, ending subsidies for fossil fuel companies, banning fracking, moving to renewables, It means transitioning from agribusiness and polluting pesticides to a regenerative, sustainable food system. And these are solutions that we've known all along, but that we have a renewed imperative to advance right now. And it also means recognizing who holds that knowledge. You know, just earlier today, MADRE hosted the latest in a series of online discussions bringing together Indigenous women from partner organizations around the world. So from Nepal, from Nicaragua, from Kenya and beyond. And you know, for example, they shared how in Kenya, Indigenous women's practices of you know, collecting rainwater for cooking, for drinking, for washing hands, their sustainable techniques around farming and combating deforestation. This is traditional knowledge that have been sustaining their communities for generations now, and that will sustain people through this pandemic. And so that's the expertise that we need to guide us now, the expertise that's led by frontline impacted communities. And the last point I want to make is around, of course, the imperative to prioritize global justice, that a feminist ethic of care calls upon us to reach across borders and really grapple with the impacts of US policies around the world. The US has, as Bridget was saying, a responsibility to redress harm as the largest historic emitter of carbon. And if we have a framework grounded in care, we can develop policy responses that both recognize this harm and begin to make amends for that climate debt, like by making unprecedented commitments to climate finance and by supporting grassroots climate work worldwide and by canceling the debt of countries in the global south. And at the same time, we have to also be lending our efforts to sustaining grassroots action globally, because that's the work that strengthens the transnational feminist movements that we need so desperately now to advance this change, and that makes communities more resilient for the long haul. You know, a couple of quick examples. You know, we work with women farmers in Sudan who years ago formed their country's first women farmers union to be able to build their collective power together and to navigate the worsening effects of climate change, like drought that was destroying their harvests. And now, because of that past work that they did together, they're able to mobilize more quickly in a crisis to distribute food aid to local communities. Another place where we work is in Gaza, where it's a place that's facing incredibly dire water shortages and has been because of both the occupation and because of climate change. And in Gaza, you know, even before this crisis, women have been you know, innovating ways to farm in urban spaces. They've been growing food in urban greenhouses and in home gardens. They've been harvesting rainwater from rooftops. And so they've been able to strengthen their resilience that they need, and these tactics that they need right now as they're facing the threat of COVID-19. And the last thought I want to leave you all with, the strategy of the Trump administration and some others right now has been to frame this pandemic as a war against an invisible enemy. And when we face major crises, from the pandemic to ongoing climate catastrophe, our answer cannot be to go to war, even metaphorically. We need to dig into the lesson that these crises connect us all and draw from the best of our ability, which is a feminist value, to care and to heal and to create more just policies that do the same. And I'll leave you all with that.
Amazing. I didn't even remind you of your 1 minute, and you were literally, my timer just went off. So your content was brilliant and your timing was amazing. So thank you for that. All right, next up, we're going to hear from Tara. And the question that we would love your brilliance on is, what is the interconnectedness of crisis and struggle in this moment?
Bridget Giniw, Shabuwe Koyendish Nakaz, Makwantite, Couchiching Tunchaba. My name is Tara Houska. I'm Bear Clan from Couchiching First Nation, calling in from Anishinaabe territory here in northern Minnesota. I want to thank the Women's March for hosting this panel, to all my colleagues, the brilliant words we've heard so far, and I'm sure the brilliant words that will come. So crisis and struggle. And it already got mentioned that I think, you know, we're in this moment where we're seeing so many disparities that are just exacerbated, right? We're seeing them in real time. So we're seeing that Black and brown folks are dying at higher rates than everybody else. We're seeing that houseless folks are especially vulnerable, that incarcerated people are especially vulnerable, that frontline communities, that poverty-stricken communities, all of these issues that were already there before. and I think we're kind of being confronted with what is most important to us. What actually really matters to us, as we're all kind of being separate and we're all stuck in wherever we're stuck in. It seems like the answer again and again for so many is people, right? Like people is what's most important to so many. Our family members, our elders, our loved ones. That's the same message that myself and many other people that are from impacted communities try to get across when it comes to climate. Because climate tries to, break down the brutality of what land defense, of what land destruction, of what climate crisis really looks like to real people. It breaks it down into statistics, into facts, into figures that then become legislation, that then become policy, that then become these kind of cold, removed things, when in reality, it's about people. I can speak to what it's been like for us here. We've been fighting something from a company called Enbridge called Line 3. It's a tar sands pipeline, 1 million barrels of tar sands a day. They want to send from Alberta down to the headwaters of the Mississippi River, which is not far from where I'm at right now, to the shore of Lake Superior. Goes through our treaty territory. It goes through hundreds of watersheds. Absolute madness in the face of climate crisis. And so normally we'd be looking at the threats of not only destruction of territory, destruction of place, destruction of culture, destruction of livelihood, of who we are, but also, gendered violence and the influx of thousands of workers into our territory, the influx of violence, the influx of drugs, of all kinds of different societal ills onto already struggling nations. With the added layer of the pandemic, it's now, okay, well, we're thinking about sending 4,000 to 6,000 temporary workers into your communities. Yeah, I know that doesn't technically, go with the public health concerns that we say we have, but this is this is critical. This is critical infrastructure. This is a critical piece of, what is in the public's interest, but I guess the public's interest doesn't really include public health, not really when there's profit margins on the line. And my story is the same that you see all over Turtle Island, all around the world, right? When it really comes down to it, what's most important is continuing the patterns of extraction, of theft, of rape of Mother Earth, of violence against Mother Earth, of violence against human beings, of violence against our ecosystems, against our two-leggeds, our four-leggeds, our wingeds, our fish, all of those things that are all here, right? And I really think that, that we have this opportunity where there's so many people that are kind of seeing the weaknesses in the fabric of mainstream society, that are seeing these tears where you're watching farmers bulldozing their fields because they can't get their food to market, and you're watching the healthcare industry going under because it's actually serving people that are sick, and not just like the for-profit industry that already has been. And seeing the fossil fuel industry struggling so badly, being literally being worth nothing, right? We're talking negative prices on a barrel of oil, and seeing the government just openly backing that, right? We're being confronted with all of that. And so we have this moment to build and envision what kind of world we want, right? I mean, we have a moment to really think about what we are seeking and what we can do when we come together, like through mutual aid, through our care for each other, through our connections to each other, and our needed connections to the earth and to the environment, because the environment sustains you. You are the environment is you, it is everything, it is you. So I'm hopeful, and it inspires me to be around women who are considering these things, around the feminine, who are envisioning this world and thinking of the creation of a different kind of economy, right? Not an economy that relies on destruction, but an economy that is reflective of justice and of equity and of care. Because there is no economy without people, and there are no people without an earth. And we all need food, and we all need water, and we all need air. And I think that we can do a lot when we stand together. You know, we have this beautiful power when we're together and we join up together. You know, I spent my Earth Day last week. We went out to one of these places where they're bringing in all these timber mats to go and bulldoze the wetlands because the equipment would sink. So they need to put all this matting down to bring this oil tar sands line into our territory. You know, and we all had signs that said essential because this is apparently essential, you know, but is it really? And, you know, is there something more we are collective together? Because I think there is. You know, there's the response we get is so immediate and immense when people stand together. Yeah, so I guess that's the hope I have. I would say in closing that, you know, from an Indigenous perspective, from the wisdom I think that my people and other Indigenous people around the world have, that we have had for time immemorial before the onset of colonization is, you know, we're familiar with viruses. We have been dealing with viruses and biological threats since the onset of colonization. Threats to our bodies, threats to our land, threats to our health, to our beautiful places that we still hold and carry. And as we're confronted with our own fragility, our own biology, we have a moment to think about what's most important to us. And I hope that includes listening to each other and listening to those people who still hold that knowledge so dear, because we are openly willing to share it. So, hoa miigwech.
Blessings. Thank you. Thank you. Oh, I just got goosebumps. Our next brilliant panelist that we're going to hear from is Osprie, representing We Can. And your question, these are all huge questions, is what does it look like to be collectively in solidarity with people and the planet right now?
Well, good evening to everyone. Thank you so much to the Women's March for inviting us to share this time with you. And also, it's just such an honor to be with all these amazing panelists and women who I love and admire so much, and to be in struggle and solutions together. And to all of you, I mean, in this time, collecting with women to me is the #1 thing to do. So yeah, in this quite epic moment, we need to address that interlocking crises for the COVID-19 pandemic to the climate crisis are rooted in the dominant culture's disconnection and disrespect for both people and planet, as we've been talking about, and how these multiple crises are further exposing and amplifying global systems of grave injustices. At this critical time when protecting and defending water, climate, our food systems, our health, and our communities could not be more urgent. It's also important to say that there's a tragic rise to different degrees, depending on country, in the criminalization, threats, attacks, and murders of women standing up to protect the earth and their communities, also which Tara was talking about as well. It's really been well documented in the United States, across Turtle Island, and in countries around the world. And at the Women's Earth and Climate Action Network, or We Can, amongst other focuses, we are really dedicated to addressing how women land defenders are being impacted by the increase in violence for speaking out against environmental devastation and the connected social violations being wrought by extractive economies and extractive industries. So I really want to highlight this connection that at the very time we need women standing up, they're also being attacked more. We see the devastating health links between Black, Latina, and Indigenous women living near sites of extraction and refineries, and how the pollution combined with other injustices is creating disproportionate impacts for frontline communities regarding the COVID-19 pandemic. And it's also really important to highlight that while women are often the backbone and the visionaries of movements to protect the rights of our communities and the earth, we have these additional burdens and risks. So there's the experience of, ecological destruction and cultural displacement, But there's also sexual violence and gender-based persecution and personal attacks against their children and families. And I think that we need to make that nuance really clear, that there's these gendered impacts as we stand up and struggle. And I was really glad that Cindy mentioned earlier Betty Caceres, who some of you might know. She really brought to the international community and was really a way that we could all really relate to story in 2016 after her assassination in Honduras for her work campaigning on environmental issues. And I could say the names of so many more women and I would start weeping, but there's so many women who are on the front line that we need to really pay attention to, particularly in this moment. And this pattern of abuse really reinforces the inseparable link between violence against women and violence perpetuated against the earth through exploitation and extractivism. And it really exposes the egregious abuses that result from unchecked patriarchal societies, colonization, racism, and capitalism. And all of these things are based upon the same systems and ideologies that promote power over and exploitation of women, people of color, Indigenous people, and the land. So one of our calls to action is that we must defend the women defenders of the land. At We Can, we work with women leaders on the ground in regions around the world, and we've witnessed how incredibly ingenious women are as they engage in very diverse and successful climate solutions, some of which have already been mentioned by Diana, from local energy systems to food sovereignty to divestment campaigns. I mean, women are kicking it. The real problem is not that we don't have solutions, but rather the violent and outrageous structural interferences that those in power are exercising in response to people taking power and action. And one example that has been mentioned already too is the fossil fuel industry and the financial institutions and governments who are enabling the fossil fuel industry to continue to pollute while reaping massive profits with impunity. So we're also calling for financial institutions to divest and for our government to stop current bailouts to the oil and gas sector during this pandemic, when instead, it couldn't be more clear, we need to be investing in a feminist just recovery, as Bridget and others brought up. Lastly, for now, what I want to say is that, in this time, it's also time we can radically imagine a world that is healthy and just and really invest in that vision, because there is instability in the current system. And when a system is faltering and cracking, this is actually a time where new ways of visioning can have considerable impact. And one of the policies of this new vision that we're looking at is something called rights of nature. And I don't know if you're familiar with this, but it's a different view of nature in our legal systems. Right now, our current environmental laws treat nature as property, only existing for human use as a commodity. And we need to get our living earth, our forests, and our waters out of the marketplace. In other words, our earth can't be a subset of the economy. And this is where rights of nature as a legal framework can be super essential. Our environmental laws clearly are not working. If they were, we wouldn't be in this crisis. And to really live in balance, as Tara was saying, in harmony with the earth, we actually need to change the very DNA of our legal frameworks so that they can truly adhere to and respect Mother Earth, respect the natural laws of the earth. And one of the systemic changes we can make is to move from a property-based legal framework to a rights of nature framework, whereby nature is recognized as a rights-bearing entity. In the same way that we had to fight for our rights to vote, we really need a way for the earth to be seen in the court of law in a very powerful way. In other words, capitalism and extractive modern economies inherently and by their very nature rely upon a legalized ownership of the earth. And again, it's this dominion over idea, and we really need to move out of this colonized thinking. And I think here is exactly where we do need to really listen to Indigenous women's leadership and see that they've been holding up these values that we see in rights of nature for millennium. And we have so much to learn and honor from Indigenous leadership right now in terms of how to live with the earth. And traditional ecological knowledge. I want to say also that these laws are already underway, and there are rights of nature cases that have been won stopping fracking in communities in the United States. And in 2008, Ecuador became the first country in the world to include rights of nature in their constitution. So it's not just a way out there idea, it's actually being practiced. So part of the analysis of the feminist Green New Deal is dismantling this interconnected violence against the earth and violence against women, and then really shining a light on the extraordinary leadership of women protecting and defending the land. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Osprie. All right. We've got one more panelist, Jacqui. We're super excited that you are going to close us out. And just want to say that we know that it's 8:50, but we do want to be able to make sure that we can hear from Jacqui's brilliance and then also get to some questions and answers. So likely we're not going to be done at 9, friends. So just roll with us because this is too juicy to cut short. But without further ado, Jacqui, we would love to hear from you around this question, which is, as movements, how do we tackle intersecting crises? And the big one of the big ones, how do we win?
Thank you. Thank you so much. So it's an honor to be here with you all of you who are listening, and the co-panelists that I'm just honored to be next to. So yeah, first, really to answer your both questions, we win when frontline women lead. There's so many examples of campaigns and projects where feminist principles of organizing around systemic change were the real keys to success. To advance true systems change we need, particularly in the face of climate change and in the pandemics like COVID-19, we have to be rooted in intersectional feminist principles and practices. As described by my co-panelist sisters, our communities are navigating cancer clusters, asthma clusters, violence against women, pollution from disproportionate placement of toxic facilities, disasters, food insecurity, racist hate and discrimination. And now in the context of the COVID-19 crisis, all of this is compounded and amplified. Yet women of color are rising into leadership. As the NAACP, we've chronicled the ways that women of color are disproportionately impacted by environmental injustice, and also, we've been chronicling the impacts of this pandemic on women of color and communities of color in particular. And we've also been chronicling the ways that women of color are leading on the critical components of intersectional systems change. So to give some of those examples of how movements and actions have combined to push us towards that place that we need to be in, moving us from a society that's rooted in domination, extraction, exploitation, et cetera, into one that's rooted in, as we've been saying, the principles of caring, of regeneration, and of cooperation and deep democracy. We have folks like Alicia Garza, Patrice Coulors, and Opal Tometi, I'm not sure how to pronounce it, who are directly confronting racism by founding and co-leading the movement for Black Lives. We have sisters like Esther Calhoun and Catherine Coleman Flowers, who are in the Black Belt of Alabama, leading on rural health and justice by fighting air and water pollution. Sisters like Kimberly Wasserman and Cherie Foytland, who are fighting toxic pollution from the south side of Chicago to Rain, Louisiana. Sisters like Shalonda Baker of Northeastern University and Walea Johns of Native Renewables first in Arizona and now in Oakland, and Denise Fairchild of the Emerald Cities Collaborative, who are advancing energy democracy rooted in economic justice. We have sisters like Princess Lucage and Queen Ket, who are working in their indigenous communities to address sea level rise and food insecurity with the Gwich'in Steering Committee in Alaska and the Gullah Geechee Nation in South Carolina. There's just so many examples. We have the Earthseed Collective in Durham, North Carolina, and Leah Penniman of Soulfire Farm, who are leading a movement of, and Soulfire Farm is in upstate New York, and they're leading a movement of Black local food justice folks who are centering care and cooperation and how they work the land and can create its bounty to feed our communities that are too often food insecure. We have Savvy Horn of the Land Loss Project and Sister Zimbabwe, who are advancing work on land justice, which is so critical in the times of time and creating resilience to climate change and beyond. Nia Robinson of Planned Parenthood and Shana Griffin of the Women's Health Clinic in New Orleans have a history of leading on reproductive justice and gender justice rooted in feminist practice. Elders Kathy Eglin and Ruth Story are mentoring youth on the Gulf Coast to advance comprehensive community change that is rooted in growing local food, to preparing ministers to be the voices of disaster equity in a place that's hit time and time again by natural and unnatural disasters, from Hurricane Katrina to the BP oil drilling disaster. Bernice Julie Shaw of Center for Story-Based Strategy and Makani Temba of Higher Ground Strategies teach us about the importance of narrative, because we know how narratives like job-killing regulations to super predators harm our communities, and we have to uplift narratives that are rooted in our principles of regeneration and a caring economy. Mimi Ho and Norma Wong work together with the Movement Strategy Center to ensure that understanding of the body-mind connection and spirit connection of embodiment and mindfulness are at the center of our movement practices. Kara Page and Huda Alkaf bring the art and practice of healing justice, which is so critical to communities harmed by historical trauma and present day hurts. Stacy Long of the LGBT Health Task Force is leading on the work that recognizes that justice in the context of disasters and climate change, our LGBTQ community is disproportionately harmed, as we're seeing in the pandemic, where we're seeing challenges around quality healthcare access, to people actually being blamed for the pandemic. If you read some of the unfortunate analysis, or to call it analysis is hyping, but some of the unfortunate comments that are coming out of some of these fundamentalist ultra-religious communities. Joanne Hardesty, the first Black woman elected to the Portland City Council, and AOC, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, teach us that one can be elected to office and still hold true to the types of principles that we need to advance true systems change. Angela Adrar and Colette Pichon Battle are leading framing, analysis, and power building networks that are advancing systems change. And finally, Fabiana Rodriguez of Culture Strike and Joyisha Dutta of the Another Gulf is Possible are advancing culture work, which, in the words of Fabiana, empower artists to dream big and disrupt the status quo. It's the feminist leadership of the fantastic women on this panel, though, and too many women to name, that are really, and also the many women that you all listed in the chat, that are really advancing the type of systems change solutions that we need. And we have to follow the leadership path of these awesome women who are unbendingly recognizing that systems change solutions must be community-led. They must be uncompromising when it comes to resisting privatization, market-based solutions, and other false solutions. And we must advance a world that is built on principles and practices of regeneration, cooperation, interdependence, deep democracy. And by ensuring that frontline women lead, we will win. Thank you.
Yes.
Thank you.
Yes.
Thank you.
Yes. That was fantastic. There was also a question in the chat, Jacqui, of will that list be available when we need some inspo in the next couple hours or the next couple days? So we can talk about that later, but there was a lot of juice for that. So thank you for that. Well, you all have taken us so many places. Thank you. You've taken us to a little bit of insight around some of the frontline struggles from Gaza, to the tar sands fights, to the victory in Hawaii recently, to Honduras with the invocation and the quote from you, Cindy, as well as taking us into some of the massive solutions, opportunities, and policies that lay before us and that are ours to claim. So thank you for that. I know that it's 9. We're going to go till 9:10, 9:15, friends. So keep rocking with us just so we can get some of these questions answered. There was a lot of juicy questions in the chat, and I know that many of you touched on, you know, many of these elements, but just so that we're kind of on the same page, I would love to, one, hear if somebody could talk a little bit more about what is reproductive labor. And then also if somebody could just once again kind of give us the recap of like, what is the feminist economy, or what is a feminist economy? Just so we know that can be many things, but reproductive labor and what is a feminist economy, or what is one type of feminist economy that you all are fighting for?
Cindy, go have at it.
Yeah, Cindy, this reproductive labor one is all for you, friend.
All right. Well, I am still like, I mean, reproductive labor is what you just saw, the naming of so many women and femmes and just sort of freedom fighters that have been paving the way, right? In a lot of ways, it's like that visibilizing of work that has been just historically marginalized, erased, invisibilized. But just the quick sort of way of, from an economic sort of point of view, is that, you know, we think oftentimes economies are based on economies and sort of measurements of success, and are based on metrics of profit and based on production. And I think oftentimes what feminists for many decades have been talking about has been that we can't just sort of look at the economy from that perspective, because there's all this work that doesn't get counted, which oftentimes is women's work, or what we call feminized sort of sectors of labor that are not seen. So things like service work, things like work around food production, food distribution, things around things that basically anything around the maintenance of life. And oftentimes feminists have raised the issue of the importance of visibilizing not only the work that people, women and femmes often do, which is the house, taking care of the house, but also talking about like emotional labor, right? The labor of taking care of the family and being the ones that always are the ones that have the majority of responsibility. And, you know, about 20 years ago, the UN did a report about the reproductive labor, if we actually counted the amount, and it was like something like 16 point something trillion dollars, and that doesn't get sort of analyzed in the context of our global economy. And so I think what we're seeing now in this pandemic is, you know, people being like, oh my God, teachers, like parents with their kids, and they're like having to take care of them 24/7, and they're like, wow, teachers are really underpaid. And, you know, workers on the front lines of, you know, the gig economy, the folks in, you know, nurses, all of these folks that have been like completely invisibilized and underpaid or not worked within union contracts. And part of that is like, how do we actually visibilize that? So that's a little bit, but I'll let other folks speak on the other question on feminist economy.
I just wanted to thank you so much, Cindy. I just wanted to add one tiny thing to Cindy's incredible response to that, which is because we're in this moment, I think it's also important to realize that this is part of institutionalized patriarchy, this invisibilizing of this labor. I don't want it to have it be seen sort of like, well, this just happened. I mean, this is a planned assault against women, against feminism, against you know, recognizing this labor and ensuring that it would not be valued. It's part of capitalism, and that link is really key, that you actually can't have capitalism without this abuse of women's power and the devaluing of women's power. Capitalism depends upon it. and putting women in their place, if you will. So just to add that I think it's good to keep understanding the intersection of these different oppressions because they are built into the system. Thanks.
Fantastic. And then there's one other question that emerged earlier that's related to this, which is around like people have information for community credits or other ways to think about quantifying our contributions to society that's not money-based. So I don't know if y'all have been doing work in that arena. And it's okay if not, it's all good. Cool. I'm gonna move us along then. Yeah, there were a couple of questions. One that was repeated was, what can communities do specifically to better align with Indigenous peoples' struggles for sovereignty and self-determination? Was repeated a couple of times. And then the other one that would be, that you all spoke to many different examples, but there was hunger in the Q&A for other sort of specific activities that y'all's different organizations are engaged in that are advancing a feminist Green New Deal agenda.
I'm guessing I should answer maybe that first one or take a crack at it. And I think it might kind of play into that last question too about like ways to contribute that are not monetary, and also ways to get involved with the current struggle that I'm part of, which is a struggle for sovereignty, but also the struggle for liberation, right? And the protection of Mother Earth and all life to come. So, I think there's a lot of different ways to get involved. There's all those beautiful names that Jacqui mentioned. I would also say like one of the things that I kind of have been really trying to push folks within the movement and folks who have joined the movement, folks who are interested in climate, folks who are already working on climate, is literally just to listen. I think there's like this, we've moved far enough along that, people like me are sitting in these conversations finally, that we are sometimes getting seats at the table. But I think that now the next step is, okay, so we're here and, our words are inspirational, or, I've seen so many moments where you see some elder lay this beautiful, beautiful wisdom and everyone's heart is so moved. And then at the end, they're like, okay, well, I'm going to go out and I'm going to go run for office and I'm going to go do whatever the white NGO just told me to do because their words are actually substantive and the words I heard before that are not, that they're just inspirational and they move me, and that's, I feel like the listening part means actually internalizing the knowledge that's being shared. It's not just like romanticized concepts. These are real hard work ethic ideas that we're sharing. It is not easy to actually live in balance with the earth. Being a human being living in the world is hard. Like if you're not taking advantage of that extreme capitalism that's all around us, it's actually pretty difficult, right? So like I just got done with our camp. We've been living outside for almost 2 years now off this proposed Line 3 route. We try to harvest and live as sustainably as we possibly can, which means we just tapped a bunch of maple trees and made maple syrup. That's hard work, and I'm still in a process of decolonizing. I'm still in the process of learning all these things, but that listening piece and that real, what can I do? Not just because it's not just about like, don't individuals shame me. No, it's going to take work, both systemic change and that high level, those solutions that we're all seeking for in a legislative or governmental setting, but it also takes us, right? And our consumer demands and what we seek and what our comfortability is and like all those things. I don't think that we're going to achieve change comfortably. We can't always advocate in those streams that are so comfortable. And so on that note, I think there's always calls from the line of work that we're doing in land defense to come and stand with us on front lines, to use your agency, to use your privilege, to use whatever skills and whatever you can offer, because there's so many different things. It doesn't necessarily mean like come get arrested with us or come you know, risk your body, but it might mean, you know, share food with us or uplift this story, you know, tell people what's going on, educate your children about the world around them, reframe our thinking, you know, shift your values. You know, there's always ways to get involved and to figure out what's going on locally. I guarantee there is some community, some local thing that's happening that needs help, that needs attention, that needs support, and it needs to be uplifted. There are always ways to find people and uplift that struggle. So yeah, come stand with us. I mean, if you can, that's amazing to do that. And be brave. We have to be brave. Be so brave.
Okay, I just wanted to jump in. Thank you so much, Tara. And I see this being put in the chat as well. You know, on how are we working to move this forward, I would say that, you know, as I said in my piece, we are working from these principles to really think through the multiple ways we can turn that into policy action. We have taken those principles and presented them in DC to leaders, and we are thinking through kind of a multiple strategy around the work that we want to do in movement building and education and sharing and having these types of dialogue. So again, thank you to the Women's March for this moment, but also how do we turn these into concrete policy recommendations, which is a real priority for the Feminist Green New Deal Coalition as well. And I just wanted to say, as an action point, you can visit the Feminist Green New Deal website. You can sign up to be part of to gather information and be part of this work with us. And we will be hosting a sort of town hall gathering in early May for anyone who wants to move with us on this and help us push that work forward. And maybe just to pass over to Cindy to give us a shout out on May Day.
Thanks. And so, you know, many of us as are part of the Green New Deal national table, trying to bring a feminist analysis and international analysis, bringing in an intersectional analysis to the Green New Deal. So it's not just an ecological or economic framework. And part of what we're also doing is really pushing on a people's bailout. We know the worst and first hit. We know that all the folks are impacted. We know that this government is going to continue to bail out industry and not the people. 1,200 is not enough for people. And we've seen examples all around the world where people are pushing for universal income, where people they're canceling student debt. And so this country can do that as well. And part of it is 55,000 people to this moment have died censusly. It's time to actually also put collective effort on Trump. And so this Friday, accountability for the loss of life. This Friday on May Day, which is also May Day, we want to support all the workers that are going to be taking action. So don't shop with the bad guys, you know who they are, support local businesses. But it's important for us to come together and support all the diversity of actions that people are doing with physical safe distancing, but the creative boldness that folks are showing all across the country, all across the globe. But at 2 p.m., the People's Bailout is going to have a rally that is bringing us all together, right? That we need these moments of collectivity. We need these moments of being able to, even through this means of Zoom, to feel that power that we have. And 2 p.m. Eastern, joining us at the peoplesbailout.org, where we'll be doing a rally. And at 2:30 Eastern, 11:30 Pacific Standard Time, we are going to be doing a Twitter storm at Trump. And that's important because we know that Trump's irresponsibility, complete ineptness, you're gonna get me going. We need to be able to hold accountable and politicize the loss, because this is a moment where we got to come together. And I think it's important for us to show that power. So we invite you to come and join us in struggle on Friday.
Beautiful. Yes. Are there any other calls to action that feel urgent that folks want to share before we move towards close? Just want to make sure we're not.
If I could chime in on a call to action, yeah. I think one of the things that's important to recognize is that when we're looking at this pandemic, the impacts from it are not just sort of directly cause illness, but there are many, many ripple effects that we're seeing. And one of the ones that have been signaled over and over from across our global networks, and that's increasingly being recognized in the media, is is hunger, and how the shutdown of economies, the lockdowns that we're seeing are preventing people from, frankly, being able to feed themselves. They're not able to access their farmlands. They're not able to access the marketplace where they would have been able to sell or obtain food. So this is a really huge threat that the world is facing right now, and that the answer to it is really doubling down on the need for food sovereignty and what we can do to support people's food sovereignty. And, that's something that we're working on as well. So, I put out the call for people who are, if they're interested in that, to, visit us at MADRE, but also visit any other organization that, is confronting that particular issue, because it's going to become, just last week, the UN was saying that we're on the precipice of a hunger pandemic, and that's something we need to be paying attention to.
Thank you for that, Diana. Any other final goodies to drop? Okay. Well, just want to say a huge gratitude to each of you for the generosity of spirit and time to be able to share some of your infinite and profound wisdom and insight with us. Yes, and we invite all of y'all that are still with us on this call and to join us for the demand for the People's Bailout more broadly, and of course for the rally, the virtual rally and the Twitter storm that we will also, as the Women's March, be participating in on Friday, and making sure that we're not crossing any picket lines also in the meantime, friends. So one other thing that I just want to note is that, yes, this will be recorded. We will send also out any other information that the panelists want to share, as well as websites, so that you all can get uplinked with these other brilliant formations. And we look forward to being, in struggle, in movement, in conversation, as we all, do our little part to bring forth this profound vision that you all laid out so beautifully. So thank you again, blessings. And we're gonna wrap up at this point, but hope everyone is doing what they need to do to take care of themselves as best they can in this time. So
Thank you.
Thank you all. Thank you, Kate, as well.
Thank you, Kate.
Thank you.
Good night.
Take good care.
Love you.